Now, in the last 9 minutes before the bell rings, I want to go full circle and return to this Cartesian idea of the beast machine, to try to convince you that our experience of being a conscious self is intimately tied up with our beast machine nature. And to do this, I need to mention one final aspect of perceptual inference, which has a lot to do with Carl Friston, who's done a lot of work in the Bayesian brain at UCL here in London. And if we think of the brain as being in the business of minimizing prediction errors, this can be done either by updating our perceptual predictions, which is what I've been talking about so far. And this is what Helmholtz had. Or we can minimize prediction errors by making actions. We can change what we predict, or we can make an action so that our predictions come true. You can change your sensory input, or you can change what you believe about your sensory input. One point of doing this is that you can make actions then to find out more about the world that's around you. And this is what Helmholtz has in mind when he says that each movement we make, by which we alter the appearance of objects, should be thought of as an experiment designed to test whether we've understood correctly the invariant relations of the phenomena before us. Richard Gregory much later said something similar when he talked about perception as hypothesis testing. The point of this is that we make eye movements and other kinds of movements to understand what the world is like, that in fact there is a tomato there, for instance. But there's another way to think about active inference, which is that when we minimize prediction error, what we're actually doing is controlling a sensory variable. We're preventing it from changing because we're making our prediction about what it is come true. And this is the use of active inference to control or regulate something rather than to understand what the causes of that something are. And this brings a very different tradition to mind, which is 20th century cybernetics. And this is Ross Ashby, who was a pioneer of this way of thinking. And he, with Roger Conan, and right at the end of his life, he wrote a paper, and the title of the paper was "Every Good Regulator of a System Must Be a Model of That System." The idea here is that if you want to regulate something very precisely, then you need a good model of what affects that system. Now, you could apply this idea to the external world as well. When you try to catch a cricket ball, you're actually trying to control the level of the angle above the horizon. But it applies more naturally, I think, to the internal state of our body. So that really what matters about my internal physiological condition, I don't really need to know exactly what it's like inside my body. I don't care about that at all. But I need to control it. My brain needs to regulate it. So this way of thinking about active inference applies more naturally to interoception. Think about it this way, that having good predictive models are always useful, but we can have a pendulum that swings on the one hand towards control. We can use these predictive models for control, and that's more applied to the state of our internal body. Or we can swing the other way and think about perception and understanding. You could think of it as instrumental or epistemic ways of thinking about the role of action in perception. And this brings to mind, I mentioned Carl Friston. He's come up with this thing called the free energy principle. And I can only nod to the vast body of work he's done here on this with the slogan, which is that organisms, over the long run, maintain themselves in states in which they expect to be in virtue of having good predictive models about their own internal condition. So this takes us right back to Descartes, but in a very different way. As I said right at the beginning of this lecture, for Descartes, our physiological reality was rather irrelevant to our mind, our rationality, our consciousness. This is a quote from a 1968 paper on his beast machine argument. Without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. Now, I think if you try to think how this idea of our predictive models controlling our internal physiological state and the resulting experiences, that perceptual content that might give rise to, you can make the opposite case. And the opposite case would be that conscious selfhood emerges because of and not in spite of the fact that we are beast machines. I think this is a deeply embodied view of consciousness and self, and it speaks to a fundamental link and continuity between what it is to be alive, what it is to have a mind, and what it is to be a conscious self. So I repeat the third take-home message. It should make even more sense now that I predict myself, therefore I am, and I am a conscious self because I'm self-fulfilling predictions about my own physiological persistence over time. Now, why does any of this matter? It's a lot of interesting ideas, but why should we be interested in studying consciousness? Well, it's a very interesting thing. I hope I've convinced you, but there are lots of practical reasons to be interested as well. There are between 20 and 60,000 patients in the UK alone who are in disorders of consciousness, who are in the vegetative state or in coma or some other severely abnormal state of consciousness. Having better measures of conscious level, as I described at the beginning, is going to really change the game in how we treat people like this. And of course, in psychiatry psychiatric disorders are increasing their prevalence across all modern societies, and it's estimated 1 in 6 of us at any one time are suffering from a psychiatric condition. And understanding the mechanisms that underlie conscious content and conscious self, because a lot of psychiatric disorders include disturbances of the way we experience our body, even though that might not be the most obvious symptom, can help us understand the mechanisms involved in psychiatric disorders and not just the symptoms. There are also some more general reasons for studying consciousness, which bring up some ethical questions. When does consciousness emerge in development? Are newborn babies conscious, or does consciousness start even in the womb? Maybe different dimensions of consciousness emerge at different times. Are other animals conscious? Well, I think you can make a very good case for mammals and primates, but what about the octopus? The octopus has more neurons in its arms than in its central brain. They're very smart creatures. Here you have to ask the question, not only what is it like to be an octopus, but what is it like to be an octopus arm? And finally, with the rise of artificial intelligence, we should begin to ask questions about what would it take for a machine to have some kind of subjective experience. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, but we should consider what science can tell us about its possibility, because that would raise some very, very tricky ethical questions. But fundamentally, consciousness remains fascinating for me for the same reason that's motivated people throughout the ages. I mean, Hippocrates, the founder of modern medicine, put it one way. He said, from the brain and from the brain alone arise our sorrows, our joys. And he also had his first theory of psychiatry, that madness comes from its moistness. And then Francis Crick in the 1990s, who I mentioned at the beginning, who gave birth, if you like, to the modern neuroscience of consciousness, he said much the same thing in his astonishing hypothesis. But there is this mystery and wonder still about how the biological machinery inside our heads gives rise to the rich inner universe that makes life worth living. And despite this mystery, modern science is making progress. I hope I've given you a flavor. Even though we don't understand how consciousness happens, we can begin to understand its mechanisms. So we should not be afraid of naturalizing consciousness. It's not a bad thing to understand its basis in the material world. As so often in science, with greater understanding comes a larger sense of wonder and a greater realization that we are part of and not apart from the rest of nature.
Hello, I'm Allison. I have read a lot about neuroscience since 2003 and is fond of it. In 2016, I discovered a great novel on neuroscience, the unique book I'd like to share with you on this channel here for 3 reasons. 1. It shows you an original approach to neuroscience that has been never done before. 2. It's quite well written, you're totally captivating. That's an amazing thriller. And 3. It is based on a serious and true study about electromagnetic harassment. I highly recommend you this book entitled Neuroscience, Crime and Corruption, White Mind Distortion for 2 main reasons. 1. It deals with neuroscience in a totally different way as usual. The innovative form used is a novel. And I'm pretty sure that you have never ever read a novel about neuroscience, but articles and studies. The second reason is the quality of the book. Well, it's pretty good written and the story is captivating. You can click on the link here to know more about the story, which is a thriller. What I can tell you is I couldn't help myself reading when I started. I was so in. The characters are incredibly amazing, and the story is so unbelievable. What an experience. So if you want to know more about this book, and I think I'm gonna make more videos like this, just click here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and share this video. Bye.